The alarms started before I even reached my station, and that alone told me something was wrong. Alarms on the Conclave Naval Academy ring station never start before the officers know what they mean. This time the officers looked just as lost as the rest of us. I was Kessa Vantil, third-year cadet, half asleep, sprinting down a corridor with my boots only half-laced, when the entire station tilted into silence. Every screen in every hallway switched to the same feed at once. A single ship, not a fleet, not a formation. One ship, sitting at the very edge of our system, doing absolutely nothing. It had not fired, it had not signaled, it had not moved an inch since it appeared, and somehow that stillness frightened everyone more than an attack ever could have. I pushed into the observation hall with the rest of my squad, and the noise hit me like a wall. Cadets shouting over each other, officers trying to calm a room that did not want to be calmed, someone crying near the back, someone else laughing in that sharp, nervous way people laugh when they don't know what else to do with their fear. On the main screen, the ship sat motionless against the stars. It was long, dark, and quiet, with none of the aggressive plating our own warships carried. It did not look like it was built to impress anyone. It looked like it was built to survive anything. A single word scrolled beneath the image, confirmed by 3 separate sensor arrays. Human. The room went cold at that word in a way it hadn't gone cold for anything else all year. I had grown up hearing stories about humans the way other cadets grew up hearing ghost stories meant to keep children from wandering too far from home. Humans were the species the Conclave didn't talk about directly, not because they were unknown, but because the things that were known about them were rarely repeated twice in the same room. Decades ago, before I was born, a small human exploratory fleet had crossed into territory the Conclave considered settled. The official record said the matter was resolved quickly and quietly. Nobody I had ever met could explain what resolved actually meant. Whenever an instructor was asked directly, the subject changed within seconds, smooth and practiced, like the question had triggered something automatic. What stuck with me, sitting in that crowded hall with my heart hammering, was a detail one of the senior officers let slip without meaning to. None of the ships sent to deal with that exploratory fleet ever sent home a survivor. Not one. Not a single account, not a single witness, not a single voice to explain what had actually happened out there. And now, decades later, a single human warship had appeared at our border and simply waited. Beside me, my friend Daro Ven leaned in, his voice low and shaking slightly. He asked if I thought it was here to attack. I didn't answer right away because I genuinely did not know. If it wanted to attack, it had already had more than enough time. Our perimeter defenses, the ones we were taught to trust completely, had tracked it the moment it dropped out of faster-than-light travel, and it had done nothing since. That kind of patience was somehow worse than aggression. Aggression you can prepare for. Patience means something else is happening, something you can't see yet, and that uncertainty crawled under my skin and stayed there. Within the hour, every cadet and instructor on the station had been called into the central briefing hall, the largest gathering space we had. I had never seen it that full. Officers stood along the walls because there weren't enough seats. Even the kitchen staff had been pulled in, which told me how seriously command was taking this. Admiral Torin Vask stood at the podium, and for the first time since I had known him, he looked uncertain. He was a tall, composed man who had commanded fleets through 3 different border conflicts, and right now his hands were gripping the edges of the podium just a little too tightly. He told us the warship had made no aggressive movement. He told us it had not responded to any of our hailing attempts. He told us our diplomatic corps was preparing a formal approach, and that in the meantime, all training schedules would continue as normal. That last part landed strangely in the room. Normal training, while an unknown human warship sat outside our system, doing nothing anyone could explain. A cadet near the front, braver or more reckless than the rest of us, raised her hand and asked the question everyone wanted answered. She asked what would happen if the ship attacked before the diplomatic corps even reached it. The admiral paused before answering, and that pause told me more than his actual words did. He said our defense network was more than capable of responding to a single vessel. He said it with confidence, but his eyes flicked toward one of his senior officers for half a second before he said it, like he was checking to see if that statement was actually true. I had spent 3 years learning to read body language as part of my command training, and that flicker was not the look of a man who fully believed what he was saying. After the briefing ended, the hallways stayed loud in a different way. Not panicked exactly, but charged, buzzing with theories and arguments. Some cadets insisted humanity was a fading threat, a species that had overextended decades ago and quietly faded from relevance since. Others argued the opposite, that the silence around human history wasn't because they were weak, but because what happened to that exploratory fleet's pursuers was something the conclave didn't want repeated in casual conversation. I didn't join either argument. I kept thinking about the ship itself, about how it sat there without a single wasted movement, without a single unnecessary signal, like it already knew exactly what it was doing and didn't need to prove anything to anyone watching. 2 days passed in that strange, suspended tension. Classes continued, but nobody's attention was really in the room. I caught instructors glancing toward the observation windows during lectures, as if checking that the ship was still there, still silent, still waiting. On the 3rd day, word spread through the station faster than any official announcement could have managed. The human ship had responded, not with weapons, not with a fleet, but with a single, almost casual offer relayed through a frequency our diplomatic corps hadn't even realized was being monitored. The offer was simple enough to seem almost insulting in its plainness. The humans would send one person, a single liaison, to observe and consult with our academy directly, as a gesture meant to ease tension between our peoples. One person. After everything, after the alarms and the silence and the fear that had gripped the entire station, the response from a species we barely understood was to send exactly one unarmed individual into the heart of our training facility. I remember standing in the corridor outside the command office when the decision was finalized, listening to 2 senior officers argue in hushed, urgent voices. One of them, an older instructor named Felden Core, insisted accepting the offer was a mistake, that allowing a human onto the station was an unnecessary risk, regardless of how harmless the gesture appeared. The other officer, calmer and more measured, pointed out that refusing might be an even greater risk, given that we still had no idea what that single warship was actually capable of, or what message refusal might send back to whatever fleet stood behind it. In the end, the admiral overruled them both and accepted the offer. That night, lying in my bunk, unable to sleep, I found myself thinking less about danger and more about curiosity. In a few hours, for the first time in my life, I was going to be in the same room as a living, breathing human being. Not a recording, not a half-remembered story passed down by instructors too careful to say too much. A real person, walking onto our station, sitting in our classrooms, standing in front of cadets who had been taught to fear an entire species without ever meeting a single member of it. I didn't know yet that the person stepping off that shuttle the next morning would change the way I understood war, fear, and survival more than 3 years of formal training ever had. I didn't know that the lesson she was about to teach wouldn't come from a textbook, a simulation, or a lecture slide. I only knew, lying awake in the dark with the station humming quietly around me, that something had shifted. The galaxy I thought I understood had just gotten a great deal larger, and a great deal more uncertain, and somewhere out there, beyond the silent edges of our system, an entire species had just reminded us how little we actually knew about them. The shuttle bay was packed the next morning. Every available cadet pressed against the viewing rail, despite explicit orders to maintain a reasonable distance. I had managed to wedge myself near the front, close enough to see the small transport vessel detach from the human warship and begin its slow approach toward our station. It was smaller than I expected, sleek, efficient, carrying none of the ceremonial markings our own diplomatic shuttles usually displayed. It didn't need to announce itself. It simply arrived, settled into the docking clamp with practiced precision, and went silent. The hangar doors hissed open, and for several long seconds, nothing happened. The entire bay held its breath. Then she stepped out. She wasn't what any of us expected. No armor plating, no escort, no visible weapon. She wore a simple dark uniform, unremarkable except for the quiet confidence in the way she carried herself, like she had walked into 100 unfamiliar rooms before, and never once needed permission to belong in any of them. She looked, if anything, barely older than most of the senior cadets standing around me. I remember thinking, in that strange suspended moment, that an entire species the Conclave had spent decades treating like a ghost story had just sent us someone who looked like she should still be in school herself. I had no idea yet how wrong that first impression would turn out to be. Her name was Maya Holt, and she introduced herself with a small, almost amused smile, as if she found the formality of the entire situation a little unnecessary. Admiral Vask greeted her personally, flanked by senior officers who all stood a half-step too stiff, too careful, the way people stand when they're trying very hard not to show how nervous they actually are. Maya didn't seem nervous at all. She shook the Admiral's hand, glanced briefly around the hangar at the cadets crowded along the rail, and gave us a quick, easy nod, like she was greeting a room full of curious students rather than an entire station that had spent the last 3 days bracing for an attack. I expected her to be escorted straight to a secure diplomatic suite, kept far away from cadets like me. Instead, within an hour, an announcement went out across the entire academy. Maya Holt would be sitting in on advanced tactics classes for the duration of her stay, as an observer, and, if instructors permitted, an occasional contributor to discussion. The room buzzed with disbelief when the announcement reached us. A human, sitting in our classroom, not behind reinforced glass, not separated by security personnel, sitting among us, close enough to speak to directly. My advanced tactics class met in the early afternoon, and I arrived 20 minutes early, which I never did, just to make sure I had a seat with a clear view. By the time the room filled, every seat was taken, and several cadets stood along the back wall despite the instructor's clear annoyance at the overcrowding. Instructor Felden Kaur, the same officer who had argued against allowing Maya onto the station in the first place, stood at the front with his arms crossed, clearly displeased about the entire situation, but unable to do anything about a decision made above his authority. Maya walked in a few minutes after the rest of us, dressed in the same simple dark uniform from the hangar, carrying nothing with her. No datapad, no notes, nothing. She found an empty seat near the side of the room, rather than taking the chair clearly set aside for her at the front, which seemed to catch Instructor Kaur slightly off guard. The lecture began as it always did, with Kaur pulling up a recorded battle simulation on the main display, one I recognized immediately. It was a classic example used in nearly every tactics course at the Academy, a famous historical engagement between two conclave fleets, slowed down to roughly half speed so cadets could study formation changes, weapon timing, and communication patterns in careful detail. Kaur began walking through the standard analysis, the same analysis I had heard at least 4 times across different courses. Formation Alpha collapses under sustained pressure at the 17-minute mark. Secondary fleet repositions to flank at the 22-minute mark. The usual rhythm of the lecture, familiar and predictable. About 10 minutes in, Maya raised her hand. Kaur paused, visibly surprised, and after a moment of hesitation, nodded for her to speak. She asked, in a calm, unhurried voice, why the simulation was being shown at half speed. Kaur explained, a little defensively, that slowing the engagement allowed cadets to properly study tactical decisions without the chaos of real-time combat obscuring the details. Maya considered this for a moment, then asked if she could see the same simulation at its original speed. The room went quiet. Kaur clearly wanted to refuse, but with the entire class watching and an admiral somewhere likely monitoring this exact interaction, he reluctantly pulled up the settings and adjusted the playback. What happened next changed something in the room that I don't think any of us fully understood until much later. At real speed, the battle was unrecognizable from the version we had all studied for years. The careful, methodical pacing we had been taught to analyze collapsed into something frantic, overwhelming, almost impossible to follow. Formation Alpha didn't gracefully collapse under sustained pressure. It disintegrated in under 4 seconds. Ships breaking apart faster than any human reaction time could process, faster than any of the calm tactical decisions Kaur had spent years describing to cadets, like they were chess moves made with careful deliberation. Maya let the silence sit for a moment after the simulation ended, then asked a simple question. She asked how many of the officers actually present during that real engagement had time to make the deliberate, calculated decisions we had just spent 10 minutes discussing. Nobody answered, because nobody knew. Because none of us had ever actually considered that question before. We had spent years studying battles as if they were puzzles solved by patient, rational minds, when the reality, the version we had just witnessed, looked nothing like patience or rationality. It looked like chaos that happened to produce survivors on one side and none on the other. Core tried to recover, explaining that the slowed version still accurately represented the tactical principles involved, even if the timing was compressed for educational purposes. Maya didn't argue with him directly. She simply asked another question, and this one landed even harder than the first. She asked what percentage of cadets in this class had ever actually experienced real combat, even in a controlled training environment, at full uncontrolled speed, without the safety net of slowed playback and careful narration. The room stayed silent, because the answer, for every single one of us, was none. I felt something shift in my chest in that moment, a small crack in a foundation I hadn't realized I was standing on. We had spent 3 years training for war, using simulations designed to make war comprehensible, structured, almost peaceful in its presentation, and the first time someone who had likely experienced the real thing walked into our classroom, she had exposed that entire structure in under 15 minutes, without raising her voice, without criticizing anyone directly, simply by asking the right questions in the right order. For the rest of the class period, the entire lecture transformed. Core, perhaps sensing he had lost control of the direction of the discussion, allowed Maya to continue asking questions, and the rest of us sat forward in our seats, hanging on every word, in a way I had never experienced in any class before. She walked us through 3 more simulations that day, each one familiar from previous lectures, each one revealed at real speed to be almost unrecognizable from the controlled, narrated versions we had studied. She didn't lecture us in the traditional sense. She asked questions, waited for our answers, gently corrected our assumptions, and let the simulations themselves do most of the teaching. By the end of the session, something had changed in the room that I couldn't quite name yet, but I felt it clearly. We had walked in thinking we understood combat, tactics, the rhythm of war, as something structured and analyzable. We walked out with the uncomfortable realization that everything we had learned had been carefully softened, slowed, and simplified, and that the reality behind it was something none of us had ever truly been prepared to face. After class ended, most cadets filed out quickly, quiet and unusually subdued. I lingered near the back of the room, partly out of curiosity, partly because I wasn't entirely ready to process what I had just witnessed. Maya noticed me lingering and gave me a small, curious look, the kind that invited conversation without demanding it. I asked her, somewhat nervously, why she had chosen those particular simulations to question, out of everything she could have picked apart in that lecture. She considered the question for a moment before answering. She said the simulations themselves weren't the point. The point was that an entire generation of officers was being trained to think of war as something orderly, something that rewarded careful, measured thinking above all else. When in her experience, the officers who actually survived real engagements were the ones who could adapt instantly, who could function effectively, even when every careful plan fell apart in the first 4 seconds. I asked her, carefully, if that was something she had experienced herself. She didn't answer directly. She simply said that some lessons were better learned through questions than through stories, and that I would understand what she meant soon enough. I didn't know it then, but that single conversation, brief as it was, marked the beginning of something that would reshape not just my understanding of combat, but my understanding of an entire species the Conclave had spent decades teaching us to fear, without ever actually trying to understand. Over the following days, Maya's presence at the academy settled into an uneasy rhythm. Some instructors, like Core, remained visibly resentful of her presence, treating every question she asked as a challenge to their authority, rather than what it actually was, a genuine attempt to push us toward better understanding. Others, surprisingly, began adjusting their own lectures, slowing down less, showing more raw footage, encouraging cadets to ask harder questions, instead of simply memorizing established doctrine. I found myself attending every class Maya sat in on, rearranging my schedule whenever necessary, just to be in the room when she spoke. My friend Daro Ven noticed quickly, and one evening in the dining hall, he asked me directly why I was so fixated on a human nobody had been sure we could even trust a few days earlier. I tried to explain it to him, though I wasn't entirely sure I understood it myself yet. I told him that every other instructor I had ever studied under taught us what had happened, the sequence of events, the tactical decisions, the lessons extracted neatly from historical record. Maya taught us something different. She taught us how it felt to not know what was about to happen, how it felt to make decisions without the comfort of hindsight, how it felt to function inside chaos, rather than analyze it safely from the outside afterward. Darrow didn't fully understand what I meant. Not yet. But he didn't argue with me either. He simply asked if I thought she could be trusted, given everything the Conclave had never properly explained about her species. I told him honestly that I didn't know, but I also told him that for the first time in 3 years of formal training, I felt like I was actually learning something true, rather than something carefully arranged to be comfortable. Neither of us realized, sitting there in the dining hall with half-finished meals in front of us, just how much more uncomfortable the truth was about to become. A week into Maya's stay, the Academy assigned her to a special advanced seminar, reserved for cadets in their final year, those of us closest to graduation, and closest to actual command postings. I had been moved into that seminar early, a small honor that came with its own pressure, since it meant sitting in a room with cadets who had outranked me in experience for years. The seminar met in a smaller classroom than the main lecture hall, just 20 of us arranged in a loose circle rather than rows, with Instructor Core reluctantly stepping back to allow Maya to lead more of the discussion directly. I think even he had begun to realize, however unwillingly, that something valuable was happening in these sessions, even if he refused to admit it out loud. That particular afternoon, Maya began the class differently than usual. Instead of pulling up a recorded simulation, she simply started talking, describing a scenario rather than displaying it. She described a small transport convoy moving through contested space, escorted by only 2 defensive vessels, carrying supplies rather than weapons. She described the convoy losing contact with command for several hours due to a communication relay failure, a routine technical problem that should have resolved itself without incident. She described in careful, measured detail what happened when an unidentified vessel intercepted that convoy during those several silent hours, and the impossible decisions the convoy commander had to make with incomplete information, no support, and no way of knowing if the encounter would resolve peacefully or violently. She didn't tell us how the scenario ended. She simply stopped talking and asked us what we would have done in the commander's position. The room erupted into discussion immediately, cadets offering their analysis, their proposed strategies, their confident assessments of the correct tactical response. I found myself, like most of the others, reaching for my notebook automatically, the way I had been trained to do since my first year at the academy. Every lecture, every scenario, every piece of information worth remembering went into careful written notes, organized by category, reviewed before every examination. I had my notebook open, pen ready, prepared to capture the key lessons from this scenario the way I had captured key lessons from every other lecture I had ever attended. But as I sat there, listening to my classmates debate tactical responses, watching Maya's expression as she listened without interrupting, something stopped me before I wrote a single word. I realized, somewhat suddenly, that this wasn't a scenario at all. The details were too specific, too precise, too carefully recalled. The hesitation in her voice when she described the silence during those communication blackout hours wasn't the hesitation of someone constructing a hypothetical example for educational purposes. It was the hesitation of someone remembering something that had actually happened. I set my pen down slowly and just listened. The discussion continued around me for several more minutes, cadets offering increasingly confident solutions, until Core, perhaps noticing that Maya hadn't engaged with any of the proposed answers, finally addressed her directly. He asked what the correct response actually was, expecting, I think, a clean tactical answer he could write on the board for everyone to copy down. Maya was quiet for a long moment before answering. She said there wasn't a correct response, not in the way we had been trained to think about correct responses. She said the convoy commander made a decision in less than 9 seconds, with incomplete information, no time to consult anyone, and no way of knowing which choice would actually lead to survival. She said the decision that was made worked, but that didn't make it correct in any objective sense. It simply made it the decision that happened to result in everyone coming home. The room had gone quiet again, the kind of quiet that settles over a group of people slowly realizing they had misunderstood the entire purpose of an exercise. It was around this point that Core, scanning the room out of old habit, noticed me sitting with my notebook closed, pen resting untouched beside it, while every other cadet around me still had pages filled with careful notes. He called my name directly, his voice carrying that particular edge instructors use when they want to make an example of someone in front of the rest of the class. He asked me, in front of everyone, why I wasn't taking notes. Every head in the room turned toward me at once. I felt my face flush, felt the old instinct to apologize immediately, to scramble for my pen and pretend I had simply lost focus for a moment. That would have been the easy answer, the answer that avoided any further attention. But sitting there, with Maya's quiet, steady gaze somewhere near the edge of my vision, I found myself saying something different instead. I told him that I wasn't taking notes because there was nothing to write down. He pressed further, clearly annoyed, asking what exactly I meant by that, since the entire purpose of the seminar was to learn from the scenario being discussed. I tried to explain, my voice steadier than I expected it to be, given how nervous I felt. I told him that every other lecture I had ever attended taught us information, facts, sequences of events, tactical principles extracted from history, and arranged neatly enough to be copied down and memorized for an examination. But what Maya was describing wasn't information in that sense. It wasn't a lesson constructed for educational purposes. It was something she had lived through, something real. And you couldn't take notes on a person teaching you what fear actually feels like in the moment it happens. You could only listen, and try to understand it the way it actually existed, rather than the way it would look once it had been simplified down into a sentence worth memorizing. I said that writing it down would have meant treating it like every other lesson, something to be filed away and recalled later for a test, when what she was actually offering us was something far more valuable and far more uncomfortable than that. She wasn't teaching us facts about tactics. She was teaching us what it actually felt like to make a decision when you had no time, no certainty, and everything to lose, and that wasn't something you could capture accurately in written notes no matter how carefully you tried. The room stayed completely silent after I finished speaking. I half expected Core to dismiss what I had said, to insist I was overcomplicating a simple academic exercise. Instead, he said nothing for several long seconds, glancing briefly toward Maya, who hadn't moved, hadn't reacted visibly at all, though something in her expression had shifted slightly, something I couldn't quite name. Finally, Maya spoke, breaking the silence herself. She said that was exactly right. She explained, addressing the entire room now rather than just me, that the convoy commander in her account hadn't survived that encounter because of a tactical principle learned from a textbook. The decision that worked wasn't a strategy that could be taught and repeated reliably in every similar situation. It was a single moment of human judgment, shaped by years of experience, instinct, and circumstances that would never be exactly replicated again. Writing it down as a formula, a rule to be memorized and applied mechanically in the future, would actually make us worse prepared for the next time we faced something similar, because the next time would never look exactly like this time, and anyone relying purely on memorized formulas instead of genuine understanding would freeze in the gap between what they had studied and what was actually happening in front of them. She said something else after that, something that stayed with me for the rest of my time at the academy, and long after. She said the most dangerous officers in any conflict weren't the ones who lacked knowledge. They were the ones who had memorized so many rules and formulas that they stopped actually thinking when the moment came, who reached automatically for a remembered answer, instead of genuinely processing the unique reality in front of them, and that gap, between memorized knowledge and genuine understanding, was exactly where good people stopped coming home. Core, to his credit, didn't argue with her. He simply nodded slowly, something unreadable passing across his expression, and moved the discussion forward without calling on me again, though I noticed him glancing in my direction several more times throughout the rest of the session. After class ended, most of the other cadets left quickly, still processing what had happened, the unusual tension that had settled over the room during that exchange. Darrow lingered near the door, waiting for me, a look of cautious curiosity on his face, clearly wanting to discuss what had just occurred, but unsure how to start. Before I reached him, Maya stopped me near the front of the room, her voice quiet enough that only I could hear it clearly. She told me that most cadets spent their entire training trying to learn the right answers. She said I had just demonstrated, without realizing it, that I had started learning how to actually think instead, and that the difference between those two things would matter far more than I currently understood, especially given everything that was still unfolding between our peoples. I asked her, carefully, what she meant by that last part, about everything still unfolding. She hesitated for a moment, and in that hesitation, I saw something I hadn't seen in her before, not in any of our previous conversations. I saw genuine reluctance, the careful weighing of how much to actually say. She told me that the ship sitting at the edge of our system wasn't a routine diplomatic vessel. It wasn't here purely as a gesture of goodwill, despite how the official narrative had been framed for the Academy and for the wider conclave public. She said it would be easier to explain everything properly during a different conversation, one with fewer people around, and asked if I would be willing to meet her later that evening, away from the structured environment of the classroom. I agreed immediately, more out of curiosity than caution, though some quiet part of me recognized that whatever she was about to tell me would likely change how I understood everything that had happened over the past week. Darrow caught up with me as I left the room, immediately asking what Maya had said to me privately. I told him only part of it, the agreement to meet later that evening, leaving out the deeper implication in her tone, the sense that something larger and more serious was being carefully kept from most of the Academy. He didn't push further, sensing correctly that I wasn't ready to discuss the rest yet, not until I understood it myself. That evening, walking toward the quiet observation deck where Maya had asked to meet, I found myself thinking back over everything that had happened since the warship first appeared. The alarms, the silence, the single human stepping off a shuttle into a hangar full of frightened cadets, the careful unraveling of everything we thought we understood about tactics and warfare, and the species we had spent decades being taught to fear without ever truly understanding. I didn't know yet that the conversation waiting for me on that observation deck would reveal exactly why that single ship had really come, and that the truth behind it was far more serious and far more personal than anything the Academy's official briefings had prepared any of us to face. The observation deck was quiet when I arrived, far enough from the main living quarters that most cadets rarely bothered visiting it outside of scheduled astronomy sessions. The lights had been dimmed automatically for the evening cycle, leaving the wide viewport as the brightest thing in the room, stars scattered across the darkness beyond, and somewhere out past the edge of visible space, the silent shape of the human warship that had started all of this. Maya was already there when I arrived, standing near the viewport with her arms loosely crossed, looking out at the stars with an expression I couldn't quite read. She didn't turn immediately when I entered, and for a moment, I simply stood near the entrance, unsure whether to announce myself or wait. She spoke first, without turning around, asking if I had ever wondered why the conclave taught so little about humanity's actual history, despite humans being a known, documented species for decades. I admitted that I had wondered about it, especially recently, though I had always assumed the lack of information was simply due to limited contact between our peoples, rather than anything deliberate. She turned to face me then, and the careful, measured calm she usually carried seemed to shift slightly, replaced by something heavier, something more tired. She told me the limited information wasn't an accident. It was a choice, made deliberately by conclave leadership decades ago, after the incident with the exploratory fleet I had heard whispered about my entire life, but had never heard explained properly by anyone in an official capacity. I asked her, carefully, what had actually happened. She was quiet for a moment, choosing her words with obvious care, before she began. She explained that decades earlier, a small human exploratory fleet had crossed into a region of space the conclave considered settled territory, though the boundary itself had never been clearly communicated to humanity at the time. It wasn't an invasion. It wasn't even an aggressive incursion. It was a survey mission, lightly armed, focused on mapping unfamiliar systems, operating under the reasonable assumption that unclaimed space remained open for exploration. The conclave, however, interpreted the presence of that fleet differently. Several conclave warships were dispatched to intercept and remove the human vessels from the region, under standing orders that prioritized swift resolution over careful diplomatic contact. She paused there, her expression tightening slightly, before continuing. She told me that the resulting encounter wasn't a battle, in the way the Academy's history lessons had always implied, when the subject came up briefly, before being changed. It was closer to a misunderstanding that escalated faster than anyone involved had time to properly process. Two unfamiliar fleets reacting to perceived threats neither side had intended, communication breaking down at exactly the moment it was needed most. By the time the encounter ended, Every conclave vessel sent to intercept that human fleet had been disabled or destroyed. Not because the human exploratory ships were heavily armed warships, but because they were equipped with defensive technology decades ahead of what conclave intelligence had assumed humanity possessed. Technology developed not for conquest, but for survival, in an unforgiving, unexplored frontier where backup and reinforcement were rarely an option. I asked her, my voice quieter than I intended, why none of those conclave officers had ever returned to explain what had actually happened. She told me the truth, gently but directly. The human fleet hadn't destroyed them out of aggression or cruelty. In the chaos of that escalating encounter, casualties had occurred on both sides, and the conclave vessels that survived the initial engagement had retreated rather than continued fighting. But conclave leadership, embarrassed by the outcome and unwilling to admit that a single misjudged encounter had resulted in such significant losses against a species they had assumed was far less capable, chose instead to bury the details entirely, allowing rumor and fear to fill the silence where an honest account should have existed. The story that grew from that silence, the half-whispered warnings about humanity that every cadet at the academy absorbed without ever questioning, hadn't come from humanity's actions at all. It had come from the conclave's own unwillingness to admit a costly mistake. I stood there for a long moment, processing everything she had just told me, feeling the careful structure of everything I had been taught my entire life shifting uncomfortably beneath me. I asked her, finally, why the warship had come now, after decades of silence between our peoples. Her expression grew more serious, and she explained that several weeks earlier, a conclave border patrol had encountered a small, unarmed human survey team operating near a disputed boundary, similar in many ways to the original incident decades earlier. This time, however, the encounter hadn't escalated into open conflict. Instead, the conclave patrol had detained the survey team, holding them under the justification of unauthorized border crossing, despite the boundary in question never having been formally agreed upon by both governments. Humanity's response to this detainment, she explained, was not the immediate, overwhelming military response that older instincts might have predicted. It was this single ship, sent not as a threat, but as a deliberate, restrained gesture, a demonstration of patience meant to communicate something far more important than aggression ever could. I asked what that message actually was. She told me it was simple. It was a reminder that humanity remembered exactly what had happened decades earlier, remembered how quickly a misunderstanding could spiral into unnecessary loss on both sides, and had chosen, deliberately and carefully, to respond differently this time. Not because they were incapable of a stronger response, but because they had learned something the conclave still hadn't fully learned themselves, that strength without restraint eventually destroys far more than it protects. She said the survey team had already been quietly released through diplomatic channels 2 days after the warship's arrival, an event the Academy had never been informed about, buried beneath the more dramatic narrative surrounding the ship's continued presence. I asked her, somewhat hesitantly, why the ship hadn't simply left once the survey team was returned safely. She told me the truth was layered, more complicated than a single clean answer. Part of the reason was practical, a continued show of presence, meant to discourage any further incidents along that same disputed boundary, while formal negotiations took place through proper diplomatic channels. But part of the reason, she admitted, was educational, in a sense that went beyond simple political strategy. She explained that her assignment to the Academy hadn't been a coincidence or a minor diplomatic courtesy. It had been a deliberate decision made by human command, recognizing that an entire generation of conclave officers was being trained to fear and misunderstand humanity based on decades-old propaganda rather than genuine understanding. Sending a single human instructor into the heart of that training environment was, in its own quiet way, as significant a gesture as the warship's continued silent presence at the border. She told me that real change rarely came from grand displays of strength. It came from small, consistent demonstrations of honesty, patience, and genuine connection, repeated often enough and clearly enough that old fears, built on decades of silence and assumption, eventually lost their grip on people willing to actually pay attention. I stood there for a long time after she finished speaking, looking out at the stars, at the distant shape of the warship still visible at the very edge of the viewport, thinking about everything I had been taught growing up, about the careful, deliberate silence that had shaped an entire species' understanding of another. I asked her, finally, what would happen now, given everything she had just told me. She admitted she didn't know for certain. Formal negotiations were continuing, between human and conclave diplomatic representatives, working through years of accumulated misunderstanding and mistrust. The warship would likely remain at the border for some time longer, a quiet, patient presence ensuring the situation remained stable while those negotiations played out. Her own assignment to the Academy would eventually end, once whatever larger diplomatic process was unfolding reached some kind of resolution. But she told me something else as well, something that stayed with me long after that conversation ended. She said that regardless of how the formal negotiations concluded, something had already changed permanently within the small group of cadets who had spent the past week genuinely listening to her, questioning old assumptions, learning to think rather than simply memorize. She said real understanding between different peoples rarely happened through official treaties and diplomatic agreements alone. It happened through individual moments, individual relationships, individual people willing to set aside inherited fear long enough to actually listen to one another. And whatever happened politically over the following months, those individual moments couldn't be easily erased once they had genuinely occurred. I asked her if she believed the conclave and humanity could eventually move past decades of fear and misunderstanding entirely. She considered the question carefully before answering, her gaze drifting back toward the stars beyond the viewport. She said she didn't know for certain, but she believed it was possible, provided enough people on both sides were willing to do exactly what I had done earlier that day in the seminar room, setting aside the comfort of memorized assumptions long enough to genuinely think for themselves about what was actually true. We stood there together in comfortable silence for several more minutes, watching the stars, the warship a quiet, steady presence at the edge of everything, before she finally suggested I should return to my quarters, given how late the hour had become and how much there still was to process. As I walked back through the quiet corridors of the station that night, I found myself thinking less about the political complexity of everything she had revealed, and more about a simpler, more personal realization that had settled over me during our conversation. I had spent 3 years at the Academy memorizing lessons designed to prepare me for command, for leadership, for the eventual responsibility of making difficult decisions in uncertain circumstances. But in a single week, a single human instructor had taught me something none of those years had managed to teach properly, that genuine understanding required more courage than simple obedience to established doctrine, and that the most dangerous ignorance was rarely the ignorance of facts, but the comfortable ignorance of never questioning the assumptions those facts had been built upon in the first place. I didn't know yet, walking back to my quarters that night, just how much that single lesson would shape the remainder of my time at the Academy, or how dramatically it would influence the kind of officer I would eventually become once my formal training finally came to an end. The remaining weeks of Maya's assignment at the Academy passed faster than I expected, each day carrying a strange mixture of normal routine and quiet historical weight, the sense that something significant was unfolding around us, even as ordinary classes and exams continued exactly as they always had. Word of the formal negotiations between human and conclave diplomatic representatives never reached most of the Academy in any detailed way. Official announcements remained vague, careful, focused on reassuring the wider conclave public, rather than explaining the deeper truth behind the warship's continued presence. But among the small group of senior cadets who had spent those weeks in Maya's seminar, a quieter, more honest understanding had taken root, one that no official statement could fully erase. Instructor Kaur, who had spent the first several days of Maya's presence visibly resentful of her influence over the curriculum, gradually shifted into something closer to grudging respect. I noticed him incorporating her teaching methods into his other classes, slowing down less, encouraging genuine debate rather than simple memorization, asking harder questions instead of providing easy, comfortable answers. He never directly admitted that his earlier resistance had been misguided, but one afternoon, near the end of Maya's assignment, I overheard him telling another instructor that the Academy had spent too many years teaching cadets what to think, instead of teaching them how to think, and that perhaps it had taken an outsider to finally make that distinction clear enough for anyone to actually notice. My own relationship with Maya deepened gradually over those final weeks, moving beyond simple classroom interaction into something closer to genuine mentorship. She never offered easy answers when I asked her difficult questions about leadership, about fear, about the weight of decisions made without the comfort of certainty. Instead, she taught me to sit with uncertainty itself, to recognize it as an unavoidable part of command, rather than something to be eliminated through careful preparation alone. Darrow, initially cautious about my growing closeness with a human instructor given everything the Academy had taught us to fear, eventually came around as well, attending several of our informal conversations on the observation deck, asking his own careful questions, slowly setting aside assumptions he had carried since childhood. One evening, with only a handful of days remaining before Maya's scheduled departure, the three of us sat together on the observation deck, the warship still visible in the distance, unchanged, patient, exactly as it had been since the very first alarm that started this entire chain of events. Darrow asked Maya directly what she thought would happen to the relationship between our two species over the coming years, now that the immediate crisis had been resolved through quiet diplomatic channels rather than open conflict. She considered the question for a long moment before answering, her expression thoughtful rather than confident, the way it always was when she chose honesty over easy reassurance. She said real change happened slowly, through small accumulated moments rather than single dramatic events, and that the true measure of whether anything had genuinely shifted wouldn't be visible immediately. It would be visible years later, in the kind of officers cadets like us eventually became, in the decisions we made once we held real command authority of our own, in whether we chose to teach the next generation the same fear we had been taught, or something closer to the genuine understanding we had slowly built together over these past weeks. I asked her, somewhat nervously, if she believed people like Darrow and I were actually capable of making that kind of difference, given how young and inexperienced we still were compared to the senior officers who actually shaped conclave policy. She smiled slightly at that question, the first genuine smile I had seen from her in several days, and told me that every meaningful change in history had started with people considered too young or too inexperienced to matter, simply because they were willing to think differently before the people in power were ready to change their minds themselves. The day Maya's shuttle was scheduled to depart arrived faster than I was prepared for. The hangar bay filled again, much as it had the day she arrived, though the atmosphere this time carried none of the fear and uncertainty from that first morning. Cadets and instructors alike gathered, not out of nervous curiosity, but out of genuine respect for someone who had fundamentally changed how many of us understood our own training. Admiral Vask offered a formal farewell, careful and diplomatic as always, thanking Maya for her contribution to the Academy's educational program, in language that felt appropriately official, but somehow inadequate, compared to what her presence had actually meant to those of us who had genuinely listened during her time there. Before boarding her shuttle, Maya found me near the edge of the crowd, Darrow standing quietly beside me. She didn't offer any grand farewell speech, no dramatic final lesson meant to summarize everything she had taught us. She simply told me, quietly enough that only the two of us could hear clearly, that she expected great things from the kind of officer I was becoming, and that the most valuable thing I could do with everything I had learned was to make sure I never stopped asking the kinds of questions that had first caught her attention in that crowded seminar room weeks earlier. I asked her, somewhat impulsively, if we would ever see each other again, given how uncertain the broader relationship between our species still remained. She considered the question carefully before answering, the same thoughtful pause she always gave to questions that mattered, rather than questions asked simply out of polite curiosity. She told me the galaxy was larger and stranger than either of us could fully predict, and that the kind of genuine connection we had built over these past weeks rarely disappeared completely, even when circumstances separated people physically for long periods of time. She boarded her shuttle a few minutes later, and I watched through the hangar viewport as it detached from the station and made its slow, deliberate journey back toward the silent warship waiting at the edge of our system. Within an hour, both vessels had engaged their faster-than-light drives and disappeared entirely, leaving behind only empty space where that quiet, patient presence had sat for several transformative weeks. The Academy returned to its normal rhythm faster than I expected, classes continuing, exams approaching, the daily routine of cadet life reasserting itself as if nothing extraordinary had happened at all. But beneath that surface normalcy, something fundamental had shifted, not just within me, but within the small group of cadets and instructors who had genuinely engaged with everything Maya had taught us during her brief time among us. I graduated several months earlier than originally scheduled, part of an accelerated program quietly introduced by Conclave Command in response to the broader diplomatic shifts unfolding between our two species. My final evaluation, conducted by a panel of senior officers including a notably more thoughtful instructor corps, focused less on memorized tactical doctrine and more on genuine critical thinking, on my ability to reason through uncertain scenarios rather than simply recall established protocols. In my final written evaluation, required as part of graduation, I included a single line that summarized everything I had learned during those transformative weeks, a line that would eventually become something of an unofficial creed I carried with me into my early years as a commissioned officer. I wrote that every other instructor at the academy had taught me tactics, the careful, structured knowledge required to function competently within established military doctrine. But one human instructor, present for only a handful of weeks, had taught me something far more valuable. She had taught me what actually happened to people who spent their entire careers studying war from a safe, comfortable distance, without ever genuinely understanding what it meant to survive it. Years later, as I moved through increasingly significant command postings within the Conclave fleet, I made a deliberate point of incorporating what I had learned from Maya into my own approach to training newer officers under my supervision. I slowed down less when teaching historical engagements, showed more raw, unfiltered footage, encouraged genuine debate rather than simple memorization, and consistently reminded every cadet under my command that the most dangerous gap in any officer's education wasn't a lack of information, but the comfortable assumption that memorized information alone could ever fully prepare someone for the genuine uncertainty of real command. I never saw Maya again in person after that final conversation in the hangar bay, though occasional diplomatic reports crossing my desk over the following years mentioned her continued involvement in human and conclave relations, a quiet, steady presence working to bridge the gap between two species that had spent far too many decades shaped by fear and silence rather than genuine understanding. Whenever I found myself training a new cadet who reminded me, even slightly, of the curious, uncertain young officer I had once been, I made sure to share at least one lesson Maya had taught me during those formative weeks at the academy. Not the tactical details of any specific historical engagement, but the deeper, more important lesson underlying everything she had shown us. I taught them that real understanding required the courage to question inherited assumptions, that genuine strength was measured not by the willingness to use overwhelming force, but by the patience to choose restraint, even when restraint was harder, and that the most meaningful lessons in life rarely came from textbooks or structured lectures at all. They came from people brave enough to teach us not just what to think, but how to genuinely think for ourselves, and from moments brave enough to be lived fully, rather than simply written down and filed safely away for later.